This is a story about rock and a town called Rocklin. A story about people who turned rock into railroad beds and buildings, and in the process built an industry that gave rise to California. An empire of granite once existed in the foothills of Northern California. An empire now largely in ruins. A fading testament to an industrial past of gold, granite, and grit. Granite, igneous rock, formed in the fiery depths of the earth, the product of unimaginable forces, thrust upward in volcanic upheaval in the final throes of creation. In the millions of years that forged the Sierra Nevada range, a massive plutonic corrugation of granite surfaced. Geologists call it the Rocklin Pluton.
Once the Rocklin Pluton became solid through this process of crystallization, it was still at least tens of miles underground. It was not exposed at the Earth's surface. Granite is a rock that forms underground. Geologists describe that origin with the term plutonic, named after Pluto, the Greek god of the underworld. So granite does not form at the surface of the Earth, and yet here in Rocklin it's exposed. So the question is obviously, how did it get there? Well, that has to do with the long story of the ascent of the Sierra Nevada. Here in the foothill area, we're at the lower slopes. But over the last 5 or 10 million years, as the Sierra has risen, the slope has come with it. And as the land surface rose, the overlying rock that once intervened between the Rocklin Pluton and the surface of the Earth was gradually removed by erosion. And probably just a few million years ago, not long ago, the granite body finally was exhumed from its deep underground abode and was exposed at the surface of the Earth. So the granite in the Rocklin Pluton is 128 million years old, but it was exposed at the Earth's surface in just the last 2 or 3 or 4 million years. It's for that reason that the granite appears fresh. It's not deeply weathered, and it's retained a lot of its original qualities with respect to hardness and glitter and brilliance and color.
For thousands of years, the first inhabitants, the Nisenan or southern Maidu, and their ancestors lived freely in the lands of granite that would give birth to quarry towns like Rocklin. In nearby Clover Valley, the valley and mountain Nisenan met to trade and enjoy the waters of Clover Valley Creek. Their communities prospered in the natural abundance of the foothills, processing acorns and pine nuts in granite mortars that abound today along the banks of streams and even in modern parks and golf courses. The traditional ways of life for these ancient Californians were forever altered in the 19th century. First, white men's diseases decimated the population, and then the tranquil hills and valleys resounded with the cry, "Gold!" and the world rushed in. Beginning in 1848, the gold rush brought sudden, profound change.
Actually, a lot of it came in about gold rush time. When the gold rush was on, they went through this area and mined all this area here. And there wasn't much here to find because it's solid rock, but they did mine all the creeks. And then the gold kind of ran out, and the Irish kind of landed right in Rocklin. Some of them came back and stayed here, and they were the ones that were working on the railroad, and they opened the quarries. And because the rock was on top of the ground and exposed, and so they opened the quarries. See, the first quarries actually started probably about 1855 in Rocklin.
Some would argue that modern-day Rocklin had its origin with one of the prospectors on his way to the gold fields. Joel Parker Whitney fell in love with the oak and pine-studded hills and vales and brought his father, George Whitney, out to see for himself. The senior Whitney acquired the land that includes the larger part of today's Rocklin in 1855. The resulting Spring Valley Ranch grew to 30,000 acres. But it was gold, not ranching, that made a quarry town. California is the only state never to have been a U.S. territory. Following war between the two countries, Mexico ceded California to the United States in 1848. Afterwards, the almost immediate discovery of gold vaulted California from conquered province to state virtually overnight. And to bind the gold to civilization in the East, a railroad had to be built. At about the same time Whitney founded his ranch, a young civil engineer from New York found a route over the Sierra Nevada. Theodore Judah, on horseback with a pad of paper, scribbled out a path of switchbacks that led to Donner Pass. In 1862, Congress passed a railroad bill that committed the American people to underwrite the construction of a transcontinental railroad. With the organization of the Central Pacific Railroad Company, Judah's dream took shape, and its foundation would be made of Rocklin granite. The earliest granite quarries in this region of California predate the building of the transcontinental line. In the gold town of Folsom, the first quarries served the needs of both local railroads and the demands of a rising Sacramento. However, it was the needs of the Central Pacific Railroad that dictated the location of future quarries. The Elijah Hawes and Charles Brigham quarry became Rocklin's first, and from this quarry came much of the bedrock that cradled the rails Chinese work gangs lifted over the Sierra Nevada. In 1864, the engine known as Governor Stanford hauled the Central Pacific's first load of freight, 30 tons of Rocklin granite.
Well, the Big Gun Quarry actually started in about 1867. The cause for it was that some of the Folsom granite was being used in the state capitol, the base course of the state capitol. And it had black spots in it, and finally it was ruled that it was not good enough granite for use in the state capitol. So then the legislature decided to come to Rocklin, and about the same time the Central Pacific Railroad was in 1864 was starting to build out, and they were coming this way, so they told the Capital Group that They have land right here and have a quarry site right there on the railroad.
S.D. Smith opened the quarry and shipped the first granite to build the new California state capitol.
Then the quarry operated, and they sent stone to Sacramento. But as fast as they could take the stone out, there was not enough production. They could not produce enough stone to keep the capitol moving fast enough. So the capitol was built, what you might say 2 stories, with the basement was all granite. Then after that, then they went into brick and so forth on the upper layers because the production did not hold up, wasn't fast enough for them to keep building.
1864 also saw the first use of the name Rocklin. The word showed up on a railroad schedule as a stop between the towns of Roseville and Loomis. No doubt the work of the quarries inspired the name. Yet some of the town's first residents and quarrymen were Irish, and there is some reason to believe that the ancient Celtic term for spring or pool, which is linn, may have been added to rock. In the rains of winter, the quarries become pools, and perhaps this was not unnoticed by such pioneers. Rocklin's importance as a provider of the granite that built the state was strongly enhanced by the Central Pacific Railroad's decision to locate its roundhouse at the center of quarry activity. In the 1860s, Rocklin became the official home of the roundhouse, and a local newspaper reported that the town was destined to be one of the best towns in Placer County.
They put the roundhouse in Rocklin, and so that drew lots of help, and everybody worked there, lots of Irish people, and that was in 1864, 65, 66 they put in the roundhouse. Had a fire in 1867, burned it down, then they rebuilt it. So it was finally built, a lot of the sides were all built out of granite because they could keep from burning the building down. Because remember, they were burning wood. In those days, it took 16 cords of wood to make enough steam to get the train from here to Reno area.
But more than a railroad, it was granite that built Rocklin. At one time or another, quarries operated at more than 60 different locations in Rocklin. With an industry, the town attracted many new immigrants, especially those with experience in the hard work and art of shaping stone to meet the needs of a new California. From Finland came many of the early residents of Rocklin, and in time, these experienced quarrymen and stonecutters dominated Rocklin's granite industry.
The Finnish people did not come to Rocklin until around the 1880s, right after 1880s. And the bulk of them came between 85 and 1900. But they went into the granite business. They came to work in Rocklin because the train, the way it worked out was that the tracks stopped in San Francisco in the Bay Area. All the Finn people got off there because they took the southern route. There was a northern route for Finns through Portland, and they scattered out in that area. These scattered out here by saying that the people that worked in the woods and the fishermen, they went to Fort Bragg area. The farmers went down to Reedley, down Bakersfield country. And the people that wanted to work and be with Finns, they jumped back on the train, came 2-3 hours back, and came to Rocklin. And that they had work here and they had their community here. And in around 1900, right after 1900, over half of the people in Rocklin were Finnish descent.
Auspicious beginnings are often followed by setbacks, and the quarry town Rocklin suffered its share. A long series of devastating fires destroyed important parts of Rocklin, and in 1914, virtually the entire town. Prior to that disaster, the railroad had, in 1908, moved its roundhouse from Rocklin to Roseville, orphaning the struggling city.
Everything that happened after 1914, everything that happened in Rocklin was at Finn Hall, because of 1914 fire on Front Street burned down the only other halls they had, the big halls. So the Finn Hall, we went to every Christmas play we had when I went to grammar school was at Finn Hall. Every graduation was held at Finn Hall.
Well, obviously, when the railroad left Rocklin to move to Roseville, that took a big hit, and even though that was in 1908, after that the quarries declined, the whole community declined, and in the 30s there was actually a vote to disincorporate, and it did not pass, but not by very much.
Still, the construction needs of a fast-growing state kept some of the quarries alive and working. One of the oldest and largest of the Rocklin quarries is the Big Gun Mining Company, located in the center of present-day Rocklin. Big Gun at this filming still stood, a monument in the twilight of its existence. A visit to the quarry reveals how the work was done. In pits like these that sometimes reach depths of 100 feet, quarrymen chiseled away the straight-grained granite, which was hoisted from pits with derricks operated by steam. Explosives expedited the process. Darren Epperson and Reuben Rucola, former owners and operators of the quarry, explained the hard work and artistry of quarrying granite.
These people that worked for us, they had the quarrymen, and they had a great deal of patience in working and taking out this stone. When they took a piece of stone out, in those very early days, they had single jacking, and single jacking, they would one man would hold a tempered steel drill, and another man would hit the top of it while he held it and twisted. They would go down maybe as deep as necessary, 8 or 10 feet sometimes, deeper sometimes. And they would place charges in these holes. It was either dynamite or black powder. So when the quarrymen got into the good ledge, they would use black powder. When they used caps in there and electrically discharged it with a little short dynamo, with a plunger on it, it would split the stone in the same direction that in which the plane drill holes were on.
After the quarrymen split a good piece of granite, a hoist operator transferred the enormous slab from the quarry pit to a staging area.
Of course, we all were hoist operators. That's one thing we could do. And in those early days, we also had steam engines. And one of the things we did, we had to pack wood for those boilers. And the steam engines, they did the hoist work. They would also work by air, these derricks, but the steam, because it had more energy in the tanks, why, it was, if you had a lot of lifting to do, you could do a better job, a quicker job.
Okay, where we're at now is the site of the derrick hoist itself. This is the machinery that ran the derrick closest to us, the tallest one right here. It's actually a logging winch that they mounted right here to power the derricks, and it's pretty unique. What it ran off of was an oil-fired boiler that would create the steam that ran through the pipes, and then as you turn these valves, it would open up steam to these two pistons, and the two pistons are what drove these three winches. And the reason you have three is because the first winch, which is the farthest one away, is what turned the turntable. So that winch, when you ran it left and right here with the cable, it would spin that whole derrick around. There's a big metal drum on the base of the derrick, and it would spin it either all the way to the right around or all the way to the left. So that's how the whole thing moved. This winch right here ran the boom up and down. And then this winch right here ran the actual cable that ran up the boom and back down to the block. So they all three were separate, and the one operator had two pedals and 4 levers to run all at the same time, from controlling the air and the pressure from the boiler all the way out to the locks on the winches to turn them.
Given the distance between Rocklin's quarry sites and the nearest centers of manufacturing, and the stress and the strain on equipment in use, it was necessary to be self-sufficient in the areas of repair and maintenance.
Beyond that, you had the blacksmiths, who we had 2 blacksmiths working at one time, and then you had to have somebody in between running the tools back and forth to the stone cutters and the quarrymen. So that took another person. There's quite a few people that had to help.
Okay, now we're actually inside the blacksmith shop, and this is where they would make all their own tools and equipment and chisels and bits and hammers, and actually even the bolts and the hooks and the dogs for picking up the stone. It was all made in here. This is actually the site of where the anvil was. It's just a granite block that they drilled into, and they mounted the anvil right on here. You can see different work tables along different belts. Actually over here is a belt-driven lathe where they would actually turn tools, whether it was drill steel or whatever they were making that was long, like long threaded bars. Here's a couple examples, just some things that they made here. A chisel, the square nuts that were threaded they had to cut into. They were pretty self-sufficient. They did their own repairs out here.
Self-sufficiency augmented the stonecutters' art. But before the artisans could craft the granite, a rough cut had to be made. This was accomplished by a gang saw in the cutting shed.
These gang saws were used in the East, and when they came here, that was put in there about 1905, I think, So that gang saw operated quite efficiently. We would put 10-ton blocks in there in the morning, and by 4:30 or 5 o'clock, we'd probably have it sawed into 4 or 5 slabs.
Okay, right here I'm standing right underneath where the blades would be. Okay, so the blades would be right above us, rocking back and forth and cutting down. Right here is kind of a backdrop for the blades, and what you can see running up the center right here, it would actually look like an old rotten piece of wood, is all those little pieces of steel shot that have rusted onto the framework with water. So as it kind of ran down here and got cut, those little bits would fly and against that pole, and it got stuck on there. The rest of it would go down to the bottom, and there was a bucket elevator that's right behind here. It's encased in some plywood, and it would take that grit all the way back up again, and it would run off the top with water, come down this pipe and drop right back on top of those blades again. So just like the new wire saw where we recirculate the water, this here would recirculate the steel shot in the water. Same principle. So they figured it out way back then, and we're still using it today. Right here is the concrete footing for the massive flywheel that drove that gang saw. And the gang saw flywheel, you gotta imagine, was probably like 6 foot in diameter, solid iron. It probably weighed a couple tons. And if you look up here, you can see the base for the bearings. So the shaft is probably like a 6-inch shaft that would come through each side, and then the flywheel sat right in here. And again, as the flywheel spun, there was a big arm that was connected to one side of the flywheel on the top. And it takes that circular motion, and as it spins around, that arm's going this way, it turns it into linear motion. That's what drove that gang saw. And then you see the massive timber framework here is what supported that the gang saw. So you got the 4 large steel poles and then all the massive timber work that helped it. This is the water in the grit system for the gang saw. So as I said before, the saw is going back and forth and it uses water and grit. Well, as that grit would fall down, it lands in the sump area, and then this bucket elevator would scoop up the grit and bring it back up. Outside of the building is a large water tank that would collect the rainwater. So that grit would mix with that water as it came down this pipe, and it would land right over the top of the blades and get in between the blade and the stone and actually do the cutting. And then as it dropped down by gravity back in the sump, it would get picked back up and run through here again.
In the monument shed, the highly skilled stonecutters applied their craft to solid granite, giving it form and function.
It would go to the stonecutters, and there was a difference between the quarrymen, stonecutters, and the other operators. The stonecutters were really the elite of the trade. They might come to work in the mornings with a coat and a nice shirt on, and when they got to work, dressed rather nicely, and when they'd come to work, they'd take off their shirts and put their aprons on and go to work. And they were the elite because they did the carving and the fine work that was done. And everybody respected the stonecutters, and there was a very good pecking order that was respected in that line.
Okay, what we're standing in now is what's known as the monument shed. The shed itself went up around 1906, and right now it's not as big as it actually used to be. It actually used to all the way out to the quarry. Now it's actually a little bit shorter, and you see the other building, the cutting shed, right next to it. Right here is the actual railroad tracks that the cart rolls on, and the cart is what goes all the way out to the wire saw out there and can be serviced by either of the derricks. And then by winch, the cart gets pulled along these tracks and then it parks right here. And then the gantry crane from the monument shed comes on over and hooks onto the block that's on the cart and picks it up and can distribute it, or parts of the block, distribute it throughout the monument shed. An example of a work table that the stonecutters would use inside the monument shed. They're actually called bankers. And each one of these tables, they're pretty sturdily built, were set up throughout the monument shed. And as the stone blocks would come in, the gantry crane could pick up a large piece or a block and set it on your banker, and then all your tools were there, and that was your workstation. That's where you would stay and do your chiseling, or use a pneumatic chisel or a hammer or whatever to make whatever piece you were fabricating. So the bankers were set up throughout the building, and the gantry crane would just service all the different bankers, and then as they were done, it would pick the blocks up and it would set it on either a truck or a trailer. A truck could pull it right out of the shop, or if they were large enough, they would go on a railroad car that was on the tracks at the end of the building, and they would take it all the way out to the main line.
Granite residue and scrap not utilized for larger work went into the rock crusher to be recycled for a variety of other uses.
Previous to the time we sold it, we had put in a large crusher. And because we were building up waste, and then we started to produce crushed granite for precast buildings, a little over 6,000 tons of that quartz, and delivered it to Rocklin into our crusher. And that's how much it, and we shipped that to San Francisco, where it was precast. Some of those pieces on the precast, pieces on the Trans-America building weigh as much as 10 tons.
This is the very beginning of the crushing plant. This is a 24 by 48 inch Austin Western primary jaw crusher. So what we would do is you shoot down in the quarry a couple thousand tons of shot rock, and then you scoop up that shot rock and you come up here to the hopper and you dump it in the hopper. At the base of the hopper is an iron apron feeder, which looks like a large track off a tank. So the rocks land on that apron feeder, and the apron feeder is driven by a motor, and it slowly drops all the stone inside this jaw crusher. And what the jaw crusher does is one stationary jaw and one moving jaw, and it just comes together and eats the stone. And it spits out at the bottom of the jaw crusher approximately 6 to 8 inch pieces, which travel up the #1 belt over to the number 2 belt and lead to a secondary jaw crusher, which breaks it down to about a 2-inch size, and from there it gets classified in a shaker screen, and if it meets the spec size, which is 1/2 by 1/8, then it goes into a product pile. If it's too big, it goes to a 3rd crusher, which is called a cone crusher, gets crushed again, and it's a closed loop system, so it comes right back in and goes through the shaker again to be dispersed out either as sand or as crushed gravel.
Work in the quarries required muscle and skill and was hard and dangerous. Especially during the 19th century, a quarryman and his family could expect no workman's compensation or financial help if accident or injury befell the worker. Diseases caused by breathing the clouds of powder and grit blasted into the air by stone saws were always a hazard of the job.
But, he'd work out there in all conditions, because when it rained, you can't put something over the top of that quarry to protect you. So he worked in the heat, and sometimes Rocklin would get 110 degrees, and down there it's at least 30 to 40 degrees more. And so he would be working in that, and plus the rain and whatever the environment was at the time. But then later the sand and grit and the dynamite and all of that got into his lungs, and he finally died just by smothering to death, or drowning. I guess that would probably be a more accurate word. I know the people that I knew there as a child, I know they all had problems with their lungs afterwards too.
I grew up across the street from the quarry, and I was forbidden to go to the quarry, that it was a very dangerous place and I should not go up there because there were flying rocks and explosives, and I knew there was dust because there was always a little dust blowing around. But I became very attuned to the quarry whistle. It blew at 8 o'clock in the morning, it blew at noon, it blew at 4. And if it blew repeatedly, we knew that something was wrong, that there was an accident perhaps or something.
We had an accident in 1928 when Alexson fell in the quarry hole about 70, 80 feet and got killed. And at that time I was at the quarry. It was in the summertime. We were all up at the quarry, and we were pretty quick. We heard the whistle start blowing, and Whitman was there, and he blew the whistle, and we all knew something was wrong. So we all ran up there, and he'd fallen into the quarry. And then that quarry pretty much fell by the wayside. And then my brother, we purchased it.
At the peak of quarry activity, as many as 22 saloons in Rocklin did a roaring business. They offered some respite from the hard, hazardous labors.
My grandfather owned a saloon. It was Maury's Saloon, and it burned down in 1909. But because he owned the saloon, my grandmother was not accepted in the Finnish Temperance Society because they disapproved of drinking, of course. And my grandmother was a lifelong teetotaler. She didn't drink, but she was still not accepted because of that. Later in her life, when the doctor prescribed a little port wine for her, she took to it very well.
We had a guy that always, Ryan, a Scotsman. Whenever he had something to drink the week before, he'd come to work singing, I had a little chicken, had a wooden leg, best little chicken that ever laid an egg. A funny thing. But he'd do that, you knew he'd been out. But he was a good stone cutter.
For all the hardship, life in a quarry town like Rocklin was like life in small towns all over America. People enjoying freedom, creating families, building community.
Rocklin always played baseball. They always had a baseball team, not just for the school, but even older people would play baseball. And that was a social event to go watch the baseball games. Of course, they had the racetrack and they had horse races. And it just so happens that my uncle was a jockey for Whitney, and he got to go to the Kentucky Derby, and he had a horse named Embroidery, which I think is a weird name for a horse. But we have his picture, and he didn't win, but he loved going there anyway, so we were very proud of him.
Another thing too is the police. We only had 2 police at that time, and it was Paul Judge and Chuck Lucas, and that kept everything pretty much in check because everyone knew them, but they also knew where you lived, and they knew everything by you, and you didn't go by officer this or that. It was either Chuck or Paul, and then later Dick Batt was an officer here also. But they were, everyone knew everyone. And if you did happen to get into having problems, you knew who you could go to, or you didn't have to be afraid to ask someone for help.
Quarried stone from Rocklin and other local mining sites supplied the rock that helped in the construction of some of California's greatest buildings, as well as other types of practical infrastructure. A replacement for an earlier city hall destroyed in the Great Earthquake of 1906, Rocklin Granite contributed to the construction of today's San Francisco Civic Center that occupies 2 full city blocks. The building's granite frescoes are reminders of the City Beautiful movement that epitomized the American architectural renaissance of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Granite Lady, San Francisco's Old Mint, is now the permanent home of the Society and the Museum of the City of San Francisco, perhaps the defining landmark of the San Francisco skyline. The Transamerica Pyramid, glowing with quartz taken from the Bear River and processed in Rocklin. The impressive Second Renaissance revival structure in San Francisco's financial district is the Bank of Italy, now the Bank of America. Amedeo Peter Giannini built the bank into one of the largest commercial banking enterprises in the world. Built of steel, concrete, and Rocklin granite, the hotel that redefined elegance in San Francisco, the Palace Hotel. Completed in 1914 and modeled after Venice's famed Campanile, Sather Tower, the symbol of UC Berkeley campus, houses a carillon of 61 bells that ring out every day at noon. The home of the California State Legislature since 1869, the state capitol in Sacramento was, as we've learned, one of the first projects that rose on granite from Rocklin. Built in 1894, the Auburn Courthouse, with its Renaissance Revival dome, is one of only 4 surviving Northern and Central California courthouses that retains much of its original architectural integrity, including the granite from Rocklin. Strong, compact, and a testament to Rocklin's granite history, the original Rocklin City Hall is a structure made almost entirely of stone, mined and processed at the neighboring Big Gun Quarry site. Finally, to underscore the practical uses made of Northern California rock, many of San Francisco's city street curbs are still of Rocklin area granite, dating from reconstruction efforts following the 1906 earthquake. The slow decline of the industry began in 1915, when cement-based concrete began to replace granite as the building material of choice. A bitter strike by quarrymen in 1915 paralyzed quarry operations and ultimately left Big Gun Quarry, then the Adolphe Pernod Quarry, as one of the only stone-cutting operations intact and in regular production. It continued its work through the 20th century as the Union Granite Company, owned and operated by the Rucola family, and more recently as the Big Gun Mining Company.
Well, I know for Rocklin, we employed a lot of people here, and as far as the young people go here, any kid that ever wanted a job, he came to the quarry, we gave them a job of some kind if they wanted to work here in town. And most of the young people did do that.
In the last decades, economic realities, including the effect of globalism that brings less expensive alternative products from around the world to American shores, and an aging, outmoded American quarrying industry have had their effects.
Labor is so cheap over in the other countries that China now is coming into the production. India has been really big in it. And then South Africa was big in it. Now for kitchen countertops, they're getting it from all over, and it comes from Brazil and Argentina.
There is a great deal of history in that downtown area, with all of the quarries that are now quarry holes, but all of the quarries that were operating at one time, and all the people that they put to work, and then the contribution they made into the building of California is significant.
The hardness and durability of granite, coupled with the brilliant flash and sparkle that comes from the interlocking minerals, gives to granite a quality that humans have never been able to artificially replicate. There is nothing like authentic, genuine granite.
Today, many of the quarries that dotted the landscape in and around Rocklin are but forgotten holes in the ground. Some bordering on homes and businesses, others in more remote open spaces, and many are still visible from the air. The region's pluton of granite extends from the town of Rocklin to Newcastle, and from Folsom in Sacramento County to Lincoln in Placer. All throughout this region, quarries competed with each other, cooperated with each other, and contributed to the building of a new California. So into history, the story of a quarry and an industry passes. Yet the town that grew because of the efforts of these artisans of yesterday, Rocklin, California, lives on.